The Jupiter was built in 1976 at Jennings, Louisiana. She was a tanker, or an oil tanker, and her hull was comprised of all steel. She was built by the SBA Shipyards, Inc., and she was owned by the Cleveland Tankers Company. The Jupiter had a 5,400 horsepower engine, which was built by General Motors' Electromotive Division of 1976. She had a length of 392 feet, a beam of 60 feet, a depth of 25 feet, and she had a tonnage of 4,263 gross registered tons. She also had a net tonnage of 3,764 tons. The Jupiter's job was to transport oil in bulk. This actually was specifically unleaded gasoline. She could carry around 2.3 million gallons of gasoline from Bay City, Michigan to the Total Oil Company refinery on the Saginaw River near Bay City, Michigan. She had a very good service run of over 14 years until September 16, 1990, when disaster would befall her.
The Jupiter exploded into a floating inferno on Sunday morning, September 16th, 1990.
It was about 8:30 in the morning, and I was sitting on the back deck of our 42-foot boat that we lived on. And I heard the call come in over the VHF radio that the tanker Jupiter was on fire and needed help immediately.
So Bob Colby and his wife Jean hopped in a smaller boat and headed downriver to the Jupiter. They could see the fire. In fact, they were so close, they could feel the heat of the fire. And then they saw some of the crew in the water, and they risked their own lives to save the lives of others. Three days later, one crewman's body was pulled from the Saginaw River. It's believed he died instantly in the explosion. In all, 17 crew members were rescued from the Saginaw River that Sunday morning, 5 by Bob and Jean.
At around 8:30 a.m., the freighter Buffalo, which measured 635 feet long, which was actually twice the length of the Jupiter, was heading up the Saginaw River to unload a cargo of coal. She then passed the Jupiter tanker as she came by. At the time of the Buffalo's passing, according to an accident report by the National Transportation and Safety Board, the Jupiter somehow broke away from its berth and its stern swung out into the Saginaw River. This accident then caused a rupture in the hose that was discharging gasoline at the time to the pier and damaged the pipeline on the pier. Gasoline began to spill out all over the pier and onto the deck of the Jupiter. Electrical cables of 2 motor-operated valves that closed off the pipelines were then torn apart. This caused a spark, which ignited the spilled gasoline. It didn't take long at all for a series of tragic events to cause a massive explosion in the cargo tanks, and this destroyed the entire middle section of the Jupiter. It also wasn't just one explosion, but multiple. As the Jupiter ignited and began to explode, the flames were around 20 to 30 feet into the air, and the terrible smoke which followed was unbelievable. Charles Prescott, the vessel's chief engineering officer, told a Times reporter following the explosion that he later described the sound of the explosion as a sonic boom. It was so terrible that paint and soot sifted down from overhead in the sky. Members of the 17-man crew on the Jupiter began to evacuate the ship. Some jumped into the cold Saginaw River, while others tried to evade the flames. About 10 minutes later, a U.S. Coast Guard vessel began picking up crew members from the water. However, one man did not survive. It is unclear whether the man was killed instantly in the explosion or if he did not survive being in the river for too long and drowned. I have found conflicting reports stating both. However, it is in my opinion that he may have died instantly in that horrendous explosion. After the initial explosions and sonic booms which people described being heard, it was absolute confusion at first. Firefighters began to establish a water supply which stretched supply lines to the river and set up portable monitor guns. However, their equipment could not reach the burning ship. The Jupiter burned terribly through the day and night, according to media reports. Knowing the gasoline was still on board, officials thought the only strategy was to let the Jupiter just burn herself out. However, the temperature from the Jupiter was causing her hull to buckle. According to media reports, only 6 inches of hull remained above the waterline. Again, more explosions could be heard throughout the day and into the evening, making things worse. The initial strategy to let it burn was then discarded. It is also worth reminding here that over 2.3 million gallons of unleaded gasoline was going up in smoke and fire. A Dr. George Asherle Jr., if I'm saying his last name correctly, an area radiologist, had actually been at the time of the accident taking his sailboat out, named the Wild Irish, to Pier 7 Marina for the winter. While he was doing this, he witnessed the Jupiter explosion, and he saw the disaster from around 100 to 300 feet away. And I quote, he said, "It was one of the most frightening scenes I've ever witnessed." Dr. George told the Times in 2015 the intensity of it all was something I'd only imagined seeing in a war zone. Dr. George moved his sailboat toward the stern of the burning Jupiter in an effort to help the men who were jumping into the river. Total Petroleum officials actually called in extra help from Texas, a Texas-based Boots and Coots company, to help fight the fire. Crews had arrived early Monday morning and began fighting that afternoon. They shot out thousands of gallons of special foam into the burning flames, which had been burning for over 29 hours at this point. It took Boots and Coots and the U.S. Coast Guard less than an hour to extinguish the blaze. But, however, it reignited again that evening. Finally, the next day after that, Tuesday, the flames were finally put out. An investigation into the Jupiter explosion shut down the shipping channel for more than 3 weeks after the accident. Federal investigators came to the conclusion that Total Petroleum Company was responsible for the fire because of the faulty moorings. The total cost of the accident of the explosions and fires, including the Jupiter herself, was valued at over $6.1 million. The fire of the Jupiter burned through the day and night following the initial explosion on Sunday. Firefighters began their efforts to put out the flames at around 1:30 p.m. on Monday, September 17th, and the initial blaze again was extinguished within an hour or so. However, as stated before, the fire reignited again at 9:30 p.m. that same evening. Firefighters again began the fight against the blaze until it was finally put out on Tuesday morning. In conclusion, the Jupiter oil tanker fire burned for approximately 2 days, from the initial explosion which began on Sunday morning, September 16th, until the flames were finally extinguished on Tuesday morning, September 18th. After the terrible tragedy, the Jupiter was scrapped in Bay City, Michigan in the winter of 1990 to 1991. And that is the full story of the horrible and tragic oil tanker explosion, Jupiter. Well, guys, I cover ship sinkings, ship collisions, and ship explosions that happen quite a bit. when I talk to people outside of the channel and stuff, you know, just on my day-to-day going through life and stuff at work, or just, you know, if we meet people out and about, and I tell them that I do this channel and stuff, you know, telling them a lot of times, I tell them that, you know, what happens to these vessels, that of course they are lost in storms, or they were lost in collisions, but a lot of times people they're surprised by the number of explosions that have actually happened on the Great Lakes, and they are quite deadly, quite terrible. The Jupiter, I guess, maybe she wasn't properly tied down enough to the pier. I mean, after the buffalo passed her, that's what caused her to come loose. I mean, maybe the buffalo was going too fast at the time, which caused a lot of ripple currents and stuff like that caused her to break loose. I'm not sure, but yeah, from what I could see, that freighter that passed by her on the river is what caused her to break away and then set up all the series of terrible events that followed afterwards. Yeah, and that poor crew member, I gotta believe he had to have been killed instantly in that explosion. I mean, it was such a ferocious explosion from all the gasoline and whatnot. But, you know, I did come across some reports that said he was in the river for too long and drowned. You know, maybe ultimately, we may not know, unless you guys have other information possibly that could help. But it's my opinion he died in the explosion. But either way, my heart definitely goes out to him and his family and friends for whoever this poor man was. I pray this video gives some good information and insight to this terrible tragedy, and may it not be forgotten, as all the other stories are on this channel. But with that being said, guys, I will be bringing this video to an end, and I thank you so very much for joining me again on another episode of Songs of the Great Lakes. Yep, we are back to telling ship stories right now until, well, I'm not going to tell you, but until some other things come in the future. But again, I just appreciate so much the support from all of you, and sticking with me and helping me refine this channel, especially as I'm still kind of quite new to all of this and just learning all the ins and outs of vocabulary and pronunciations, as well as historical dates and names and events and tragedies and stuff like that. With that being said, guys, I thank you again so very much for being with me here today on this episode. And as always, until next time on Songs of the Great Lakes, God bless you all.